We heard someone chopping wood, but every tree around us was untouched. The sound came from somewhere ahead on the trail. A steady rhythm, thock, pause, thock, clean, deliberate, like an axe biting into seasoned timber. We stopped walking. The forest around us was dense old growth. Fir, cedar, and hemlock packed so tightly that the trail sometimes narrowed to a tunnel between trunks. Moss draped every branch. The ground was soft with centuries of needles. But there was no clearing ahead. No cut wood. No camp. Still, the chopping continued. Thock, one of us said. Maybe someone's camping. Another answered immediately. Where? It was a fair question. We had been hiking most of the morning without seeing any sign of other people. No footprints. No wrappers. No fire rings. Even the trail we followed looked like it hadn't been used in years. Yet the chopping sound felt close. Too close. We moved forward carefully. The sound continued at the same slow pace. Thock, a pause. Thock. It never sped up. Never slowed down. Just the same precise interval between strikes, as if the person swinging the axe had perfect patience. The strange part was how the sound traveled. Every few steps it seemed to shift direction. First ahead of us, then slightly to the left, then behind us for a moment before returning to the front again. Not echoing, moving. We stepped off the trail, pushing through a curtain of ferns toward where the sound felt strongest. The forest thickened immediately. Branches tangled overhead. Fallen logs formed barriers that forced us to climb or detour. Yet the chopping remained exactly the same distance away. Close, but unreachable. When we returned to the trail, the sound was directly ahead again. One of us laughed uneasily. Maybe it's a woodpecker. No one agreed. Woodpeckers had rhythm, yes, but not this rhythm. This was too heavy, too measured. Every strike carried the dull weight of metal meeting wood. And yet every tree we passed was intact. We began checking them as we walked. Smooth bark, unbroken trunks, no fresh chips on the ground, not even old scars from axes, which was strange because this forest should have been logged at some point. Most forests this accessible had been cut decades ago before regrowth reclaimed them. But here the trees stood enormous and untouched. Even the oldest stumps we found were natural breakages, splintered by wind or rot. Still, thock, someone was chopping. Around midday the forest changed. The sound of birds faded gradually until we realized we hadn't heard any in several minutes. Insects disappeared next. The usual buzz of flies and mosquitoes dissolved into silence. Only the chopping remained. Thock, thock. We began noticing other things. Marks on the trees. Not cuts. Impressions. At shoulder height on many trunks we saw shallow dents in the bark shaped like wedges. They weren't deep enough to be axe marks, but the pattern was unmistakable. Two angled lines meeting at a point. Over, and over, and over. Hundreds of them. As if something had practiced the motion of chopping wood without ever actually breaking the bark. The dents grew more frequent as we continued. Sometimes clustered in groups of 3 or 4. Sometimes arranged in careful vertical rows. We stopped counting after a while. The chopping kept pace with us. Never closer, never farther. Always the same distance. It felt like someone walking just out of sight, matching our speed perfectly. One of us tried shouting. Hello! The word vanished into the trees. The chopping stopped. The silence that followed felt enormous. We waited. 30 seconds. Maybe a minute. Then, thock. But this time it came from behind us. We turned quickly. Nothing. Just the narrow trail curling between the trunks. The forest seemed thicker now than it had earlier. Branches sagged lower. Moss hung heavier in the air like damp curtains. And we realized something else. The dents in the bark weren't random. They formed patterns. Arcs. Rows that curved inward along the trail, leading deeper into the forest. Guiding us. We followed them because the trail itself had begun to fade. Fallen needles blurred the path until the only consistent direction came from the wedge marks appearing more frequently ahead. The chopping continued. Thock, thock. Always one strike at a time. Never two in quick succession. Always the same calm pause between blows. Eventually we came to a place where the forest floor looked wrong. The ground dipped slightly into a wide shallow basin surrounded by thick trunks. Moss grew in heavy clumps, and the air smelled faintly sour, like wet wood left to rot. The wedge marks here were everywhere, carved into bark, pressed into moss, even appearing faintly on stones. But none of them had actually cut anything. Not once. We spread out slowly. One of us knelt to examine the ground. Look at this. The moss had been compressed into shapes. Long rectangular impressions, arranged in rough rows across the basin floor. Logs, or the outlines where logs should have been. Except there were no logs. Just empty spaces where something had once lain. Or where something was expected to lie. The chopping stopped again. Completely. The silence pressed inward. We listened. Then a new sound came. Closer than the chopping had ever been. A slow scraping noise. Wood against wood. We turned toward the center of the basin. At first we didn't understand what we were seeing. One of the nearby trees leaned slightly. Then another. Not falling. Tilting. Their trunks creaked as though something immense and careful was adjusting them. The trees shifted by inches, sliding through the moss with unnatural smoothness. Aligning. Forming a long straight row along the ground depressions. Like logs being placed in position. We stepped backward instinctively. The forest continued rearranging. Another tree bent at its base, lowering gradually until its trunk rested across two others. A crossbeam. None of them snapped. None of them broke. They simply moved as if guided by invisible hands. And suddenly the chopping returned. Not ahead of us. Not behind. Directly beside us. Thok. The sound was enormous now. Heavy. Close enough that we felt the vibration in our ribs. But there was still no axe. No figure. Just empty air. Thok. A wedge dent appeared in the bark of the nearest tree. Fresh. Perfect. The bark didn't split. It just sank inward as if struck by something that existed only halfway in our world. One of us whispered, "It's learning." Because the dents earlier had been shallow. Practice marks. Now they were deeper, cleaner. And the trees around the basin were arranged exactly like a crude frame. A structure. The kind used to stack timber. Or suspend something. We backed toward the edge of the clearing. The chopping followed. Thok. Another dent. Higher up the trunk. Adjusting. Measuring. Preparing. We realized then that the rows of empty log-shaped spaces in the moss weren't empty because something had been removed. They were empty because something hadn't been placed there yet. The trees creaked again. Another trunk lowered slowly into position across the growing frame. And somewhere just behind us, close enough that we could feel the breath of displaced air, the invisible axe lifted, paused, and came down once more. A thin line of light cut through the forest, moving like a blade. At first we thought it was sunlight. The canopy above us had opened slightly where two tall firs leaned apart, and a narrow beam of pale afternoon light fell through the gap. That kind of thing happens constantly in deep woods, brief shafts of brightness that slip between branches and vanish again as clouds move. But this light didn't fade. It stayed perfectly thin, perfectly straight, and perfectly bright. And then it moved. Not drifting like sunlight. Sliding. The line glided sideways across the forest floor with the quiet precision of a knife being drawn slowly across cloth. Moss brightened under it for a moment, then dimmed again as the light continued past. None of us spoke. We watched the line travel across the ground until it reached the trunk of a cedar. For a second the beam rested there. Then it passed through. The bark did not crack. The trunk did not sway. But a faint sound reached us. A soft, dry whisper, like paper being torn very slowly. The light continued onward into the trees. We looked at each other. Someone said quietly, "Did that just?" The cedar shifted behind us. Not falling. Sliding. The entire upper half of the tree tilted half an inch to one side. settling into a new position as if something inside it had quietly released tension. We walked back to it. A line ran vertically along the bark where the light had crossed. So thin it was almost invisible. When one of us touched it, the bark separated slightly. The trunk was cut. Perfectly. We stared at the incision. It had sliced straight through bark and wood without splintering anything. No chips lay on the ground. No torn fibers hung from the edges. Just a silent, flawless seam. Somewhere deeper in the forest, the light continued moving. We saw it again several seconds later, a distant thread gliding between trunks. The beam was still narrow enough to vanish if you blinked. But now we understood something important. It wasn't illuminating the forest. It was dividing it. We followed. Not quickly. Carefully, stepping over roots and fallen branches as we tried to keep the line in sight. The forest here was older than any logging record we had seen. The trees grew close together, their trunks rising straight and enormous before disappearing into the canopy. The air smelled damp and cold, and strangely metallic. The line of light moved steadily ahead of us. Sometimes it climbed vertically up a trunk before slipping across branches. Sometimes it cut through the undergrowth in long horizontal sweeps that left the ferns trembling afterward. Each time it passed through something, the same quiet tearing sound followed. And each time we returned to inspect the place it had crossed, we found another perfect seam. A rock split so cleanly its halves leaned apart without falling. A fallen log separated into two precise segments. A cluster of saplings sliced at identical angles as though arranged for measurement. Took us a while to notice the pattern. The cuts were not random. They were forming shapes. Long straight corridors through the forest. Flat plains where irregular growth had once been. Angles that did not exist naturally among trees. The deeper we walked, the quieter the woods became. Birds had stopped calling. Insects had vanished. Even the wind above the canopy seemed to hesitate before crossing this section of forest. Our shadows began behaving strangely too. At first we noticed them stretching longer than the sunlight should allow. Then we realized the shadows were splitting. Whenever the line of light passed near us, our silhouettes doubled briefly on the forest floor, one dark shape on each side of the beam. For a moment we appeared divided. Then the light moved on and the shadows fused again. None of us liked that. The temperature dropped as we continued. Cold air pooled around the places where the beam had passed, seeping out of the cuts in wood and stone like breath from hidden cracks. One of us knelt beside a sliced boulder and placed their hand against the exposed interior. Cold, they said. Not surface cold. Deep cold. The kind found underground. We began to realize the light wasn't just cutting objects. It was revealing something beneath them, a different geometry. Behind one severed trunk, we discovered a gap in the forest floor that hadn't existed before. The soil had been sliced open in a straight trench barely wider than a finger. Inside it lay layers of stone we hadn't seen anywhere else in the region. Perfectly smooth, stacked like plates. Farther ahead, the light carved through a patch of trees so densely packed we had to squeeze between them. When we reached the spot afterward, the trunks had shifted slightly apart. Just enough to form a narrow hallway. Straight, perfectly straight. That was when we began to feel watched. Not by eyes, by alignment. The corridors forming around us began pointing in specific directions. Lines of cut trees angled toward unseen intersections deeper in the forest. Planes of sliced rock reflected faint light between them, creating a grid of dim, glowing edges. The forest was being measured, segmented. We stepped into one of the corridors. Immediately the air grew colder. Our watches began behaving oddly. Seconds stretched. The ticking seemed slower, but when we checked the time again, minutes had passed. The line of light appeared again ahead of us. It traveled across the corridor floor this time, gliding through moss and soil with surgical patience. We stopped walking. The beam paused, as if aware of us. For a long moment nothing happened. Then it turned, not bending, pivoting, like a blade rotating in the hand of something enormous and unseen. The line swept toward us. Instinctively, we stepped backward. The beam crossed the ground where we had just been standing. A long, clean cut opened in the soil, revealing dark layers beneath. The light paused again, then moved away, continued deeper into the forest. But now the cuts around us were unmistakably organized. Intersecting corridors, parallel planes, angles that matched too precisely to be coincidence. One of us whispered, "It's building something." Another answered, "Or uncovering it," because the shapes we saw forming were not natural spaces. They were rooms, or the beginnings of them, hidden architecture buried inside the forest. The light moved again far ahead, a vertical sweep through a line of ancient trees. They slid apart moments later, their trunks settling into new positions like doors opening slowly. Cold air rushed outward, and with it came a sound. Not wind, not animals, something deeper, a vast shifting noise, like enormous structures adjusting far below the ground. We realized then the line of light was not searching. It already knew where to cut. The forest had simply grown over something older, something precise, something waiting. The beam flickered once more in the distance. Then it rose slowly into the air between two trees and paused there, perfectly still, as if held in place. We watched in silence. And slowly, very slowly, another thin line of light appeared beside it. Parallel, then another, and another, until a narrow doorway of cutting light hovered in the forest ahead. None of the lines illuminated anything. They simply waited, as if the next cut had not yet been decided. And somewhere beyond the trees, something unseen was considering the shape the forest would take next.